thank you, of course, because it's delightful coming to Berlin on an excellent, beautiful day and dealing with the people I know best and respect most in this field. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm a very surprised winner of this prize at my somewhat advanced age. Now, what the paper is about? Well, essentially, we're looking at the new world of hedge fund activism. And my first contention is really definitional. We have a new agent. The agent is the hedge fund activist who aggregates the support of many institutional investors and brings pressure to bear on the board for changes that it believes will be value maximizing. That's all desirable insofar as it goes. But new agents always involve new agency costs. There is a cost in other parties, the other shareholders, relying on this new agent, just as there might be a cost in relying on an investment banker. They both can have some conflicts of interest. And in this world, we're trying to measure for the first time what these new agency costs are. Now, there's several different categories, and our initial research shows that some of them are pretty benign. We don't find any harm or any great excess. But the one area where we find some interesting data is with respect to hedge fund activism and informed trading by directors appointed by hedge fund activists. What we particularly focus on is a new pattern under which hedge fund activists negotiate with the company and put 1, 2, or even 3 directors on the board to basically implement the business plans that they've announced to the world. All that's fine, and it's perfectly appropriate in my judgment. If they buy the stock low and it goes up high as they implement their business plan, more power to them, good for them, they deserve the profit. However, there's another kind of profit that's less visible that we find some evidence of, and this is the profit from informed trading. What we're measuring are the returns on new developments that are announced in the U.S. at least by filing a Form 8K with the SEC. That form is unscheduled. It's not something that you know is coming. But when the company decides they have to announce a new material development, they'll file typically a Form 8K. And what we're looking at is what happens when the hedge fund places activists on the board. And we find a major distinction between nominees they place on the board who are independent directors, typically retired former CEOs or former CFOs, all right? Or people, on the other hand, who are hedge fund employees. And we find the following differences when they put a hedge fund nominee on the board who is a hedge fund employee. And we find, first of all, that there's a very significant difference in the market reaction to this settlement that puts these new directors on the board. We find that when the new directors are all nominees who are independent actors, who are former CEOs or former CFOs, there is a market reaction measured in terms of cumulative aggregate residuals or CARs. It's over 5%. But when one of those nominees is a hedge fund employee, the market reaction is only about 1.5%, 1/3 as much, suggesting that the market is skeptical of putting your own employees on the board. We also find that when a hedge fund employee is placed on the board, the bid-ask spread widens and widens significantly, where it does not when the new nominees are only independent directors. And the widening of a bid-ask spread is usually a suggestion that the market anticipates informed trading is going to come, in which the other side will lose in these dealing transactions, and therefore the dealers widen the spread to protect themselves. And then the key statistic we look at is the ability to anticipate the future movement of the market price. We look at the trading days 5 business days before the filing of the 8K. And we find that the market moves up, the market price moves up to anticipate that later release of new information. And it moves up mainly when there's a hedge fund employee. That is, there's always some market anticipation of even unscheduled news, but it might be down in the 10 to 20% range. When, however, there's an independent director who is totally independent, there's also no real increase from the normal market movement. But when a hedge fund employee is placed on the board, we find the numbers are up there in the ranges of about 45%, meaning that the market is anticipating half at least of the likely movement that's going to occur, either up or down. That's a measure of informed trading, that people are anticipating market developments that are about to be announced. That profit comes at the expense of other shareholders. And what does this mean? I think it means to us that there is the second and illicit source of support, a kind of social subsidy for activism. Now, this is a subsidy that no one ever intended and is in some conflict with the laws against insider trading. We don't suggest that we know each of these cases involves illegal insider trading. We do suggest that there's informed trading going on here that may or may not be illegal based on other factors that we can't measure. But to the extent that you get this second profit from informed trading, that's a subsidy for activism that no one ever intended and comes at the expense of other shareholders. It may also tend to explain why a group we call the Wolf Pack in the United States holds together. The Wolf Pack is both the hedge fund and its other informal allies. They don't have a formal agreement, but they have a pattern and practice of working together. And those other allies hold their position in the company for some number of months. Why? Well, they may hold even though they don't expect a major development, because they're going to learn about in advance of the announcement of more minor developments. And using options, you can make a very large profit even on a 1 or 2 point gain. And we do find evidence that there is a lot of trading in the option markets around these Form 8K filings, suggesting that someone has tipped others that that Form 8K is about to be filed and that it will contain positive or negative market moving news. All of this is a consistent pattern, and that's our first step. We're trying to avoid at this stage discussing who's doing it, who's making the most profits, but we intend a series of articles where we're going to look at who gets the largest profit when they announce their original 13D filing, who gets the largest profit when they announce later a settlement agreement putting new directors on the board, and at the same time, what hedge funds are associated with the highest level of information leakage before an 8K filing, and which hedge funds are associated with the highest level of bid-ask spread widening. How do all these factors go together? Are they inversely related, or do they all go together? Does the highest profits go also with the highest bid-ask spread? Or are there some firms that seem to be totally honorable with no information leakage, and others that are the reverse? It would be very interesting to get this kind of information if we can get it on a large enough basis so it looks reliable. So that's what we're doing with what intended to be a series of articles, and we expect that the first one will be appearing in a late fall issue of the Cornell Law Review. Well, you know, I don't know that all hedge funds are going to get the same kind of stigma. We may find that there are some hedge funds that seem to have very little information leakage associated with what they do. They may have real confidentiality policies. Others may be associated with very significant widening of the bid-ask spread, and they'll be very unhappy about this research. But our first goal is to sort of measure the aggregate impact, and then at later stages we're going to look at who seems to be associated with the more suspicious of practices and who seems to be associated with the largest gains. It could well be that some hedge funds make tremendous profits because they find a good target that is underperforming the market, and they impose new controls and a new business model on it, and the stock price goes up, and good for them. And there are others that may be associated with a kind of reciprocal information sharing. If you're going to be cynical, and we're not yet at the cynical stage, you might think that there's a pattern of reciprocity here, that one hedge fund tips another hedge fund about what's going to happen, and in turn that hedge fund tips it back with respect to investments it makes in other companies. And from that perspective, the most cynical story would be that there is what I'll call a favor bank operating on Wall Street. You do me a favor, I'll do you a favor. That could be happening, but we don't yet say we know that. We don't have evidence that shows anything in the nature of reciprocity. We just find information leakage as a strange and puzzling phenomenon. And we're measuring this, I should add, by using a control group. Each time we measure what the information leakage is, we look at a sample of 3 or 4 other firms in the same industrial classification and see whether there is information leakage on their Form 8Ks. And we're finding a huge difference between those that have a new director who's a hedge fund employee and those that don't, even though they're in the same industry and they're subject to the same general market and exogenous changes. Well, I suspect they're going to write some of their own counter studies. That's fair enough. They get to write and they get to do their studies. Some of them have told me they disagree. They think this is only characterizes smaller target firms, although we don't see that yet as being localized just in smaller target firms. But if they can come up with a study that says it's not happening at big target firms, only at small target firms, that would be interesting. It still wouldn't mean that it's a safe, a benign practice, but it would at least suggest where the problem is. And again, this is not intended to say we should stop hedge fund activism. I think the changes we might recommend when we get more data would be much more modest. For example, all business directors have a duty of confidentiality. That's the Delaware law. What does that duty preclude? Certainly they can't tell the world privately about important material market developments. But maybe, and this is debated, they can go back and tell the hedge fund that sponsored them about how they're trying to implement the hedge fund's vision. That may be appropriate. In my view, if we find a lot of evidence of informed trading, then it might be only appropriate for the director to communicate material information to the hedge fund if he knows that the hedge fund has strong policies of confidentiality that will preclude the hedge fund from sharing it with others so the information doesn't leak into the market and interfere with the trading between other shareholders. Okay? So I would think one of the possible recommendations would be stronger confidentiality policies, and the SEC might be asked to play a role in insisting that hedge funds have strong confidentiality policies if we find strong evidence of informed trading. Our study started out by examining over 4,000 settlement agreements between hedge funds and their target companies. They've signed these agreements, and in most cases, they file them with the SEC pursuant to a Form 8K. And we've looked at those, and very few of them contain a prohibition on trading based on information you learn. They just say we'll absorb normal we will follow and respect normal securities law rules. That's very vague. That's not the same thing as saying that you can't give this to another hedge fund. You might be able to say, well, as long as the other hedge fund promises to maintain confidentiality, we can give it to them. But the truth is, as soon as a secret is known by a certain number of people, it's no longer a secret. And a secret known by 40 people is in the market and already impacting price. Well, again, we're doing this as ongoing work, and I don't want to anticipate all our conclusions. We're trying to stay modestly just looking at the phenomenon without mentioning any names yet. Later on, we want to see if this is all a similar pattern or if there's high variance among different hedge funds. That's what we don't know yet, and we'll find out later. That's all I really want to say about that article. Well, I'm delighted to be here because I think the ECGI is doing God's work in the field of corporate governance. I think it is the one venue, the one forum where we can get practitioners and academics together to discuss relevant questions. On their own, academics may stay on a high level of meta theory, and on their own, practitioners like to make broad generalizations that aren't always supported by evidence. But you bring the two together, you begin to formulate hypotheses that can be tested. And I think hedge fund activism is only one such field. We can look at disclosure policies, we can look at mergers and acquisitions and what's going on. And frankly, I think one of the future topics that deserves more and more close empirical attention is the world that we use the phrase ESG for, environmental, social, and governance issues. Everybody has a view about environmental, social, and governance issues, but we don't have much good research. And let's find out whether or not an involvement with ESG leads to higher corporate profitability, or is instead just something that those that already have high profitability can pay out because the market isn't pressuring them much. But we can find out. We can also look at differences in firms in terms of whether gender diversity relates to anything. Do we find higher profitability if the board is more diverse? Do we not find that? Or do we find that this may be something that more sophisticated firms are doing to maintain their brand, to look attractive to the broader marketplace? All those things could be good things to do, but what can we find is empirically validated as a conclusion?